my talk. First of all, I must thank Devdatta, Namrata, Ridhima, and other organizers of this conference at South Asian University. I'm extremely happy to be here, and the topic of my lecture is some aspects of auction theory. Now, I will really dedicate this lecture to my young student friends who are just starting off with research or who are in their master's program. The objective of this lecture is to introduce you to the basics of auction theory, which I'll do in the first half of the class. And in the next half of my lecture, I will talk about some possible research question where I extend the basic canonical model of auctions. So things will be extremely simple towards the beginning. Maybe some of you know this, but I have to start in a context. So given that basic model, I'll talk about possible extension and where I have worked a bit. So again, some aspects of auction theory. So let me start with this. So our plan is I'll first lay out the stage for auction theory and discuss the canonical auction. Any one auction starts with, and then we'll explore some extensions of this model and provide some results and discuss possible open research questions. Okay. Now, before that, why should you care about auctions at all? And why do you need an auction? Firstly, imagine a situation, and in economics, we are always imagining situations that are never true, that you are lucky enough to inherit a painting, maybe by Picasso or Salvador Dali. Now, suppose now that you are in dire financial straits and need to sell the painting. How should you go about it? Now, if you knew the potential buyers and their maximum willingness to pay, the valuations, which are the maximum price they're willing to pay, the answer is very simple. You just go to the buyer with the highest valuation and sell this painting to this person at a price equal to his valuation or slightly less than it. The person will lap it up. However, the problem is that you, the seller, have only incomplete information about the buyer's valuation. The valuation of a buyer is the maximum price he's willing to pay for it. And no buyer would be ready to reveal his or her actual willingness to pay for this painting. So to arrive at the best price that you possibly can get, you have to organize an auction. That's the starting point of auction. And after all, why do you need it? Because you don't know the willingness to pay among potential buyers. Okay? And this incompleteness of information is extremely important. Without incomplete information, auctions are meaningless. Now, just to give you an historical perspective and the current one, how auctions have been in real life over the years and currently also in the world. So auctions have always been a large part of the economic landscape, with some auctions reported as early as in Babylon in about 500 BC and during the Roman in 193 AD. Now, I got this information from a very nice book by Cassidy. I have mentioned this at the references, at the list of references provided at the end of this lecture. Now, if you can read Cassidy's book, it's extremely fascinating. It gives a historical overview of auctions over the years and how slaves were even auctioned off. Terrible things happened. All these are documented in this book. Now, auctions with precise set of rules emerged in 1595 when the Oxford English Dictionary first included the entry. So the word came in the Oxford English Dictionary came in 1595, while auction houses like Sotheby's and Christie's were founded as early as 1744 and 1766. So my point is auctions have been there for quite some time. And now you must note that auctions account for an enormous and growing volume of transactions across the globe. Now, some examples of that, let me come to that. See, every week the US Treasury auctions off billions of dollars of bills, notes, and bonds. There are many papers on US Treasury auctions. And if you see the textbook on auctions, read it, you will find the references. Now, government procurement expenditure on an average constitute about 13% of GDP of OECD countries. And it's a statistically very significant fraction of GDP. For example, in India, think of Indian Railways or any public sector organization. When they buy things, they buy it in an auction. They call companies, and the company which quotes the lowest price gets the contract. Suppose JNU is buying computers, and it gives some specification that we need such and such RAM size, such as hard disk size, and then it asks for tenders. And this is also a kind of auction. And the company quoting the lowest price wins the contract. These are called procurement auctions. Now, private firms all over the world auction of products ranging from fresh flowers, fish, and tobacco to diamonds and real estate. And online auctions take place all the time with popular websites such as eBay, and there are billions of dollars being exchanged. Okay, the point is auctions are extremely important, as an economic activity all over the world. So it's worth studying it. Now, auction theory as a discipline, since I'm primarily a theorist, I'll focus on the theoretical aspects. Now, William Vickery, who is no more, was one of the founding fathers of auction theory. His 1961 seminal paper really started it all off. Now, then there was a paper by Jim Merles, although it was called a paper on optimal income taxation. I mean, the techniques that were used there were extremely helpful for later analysis of auctions. Also, Vickery later in 1976 makes additional contributions to auction theory, including the initial idea on simultaneous ascending auction. By the way, simultaneous ascending auction has been used to sell off or auction off, say, 3G, 4G spectrums all over the world, including our country. Now, the full flowering of auction theory really came in the 70s and 80s with the major contributions from Meyerson, Maskin, Milgrom, Riles, Larry Samuelson, Robert Weber, Robert Wilson, and others. Now, these are the names I have spelled out here are really the granddaddies of auction theory. So starting from 61, it has come of age, and now it's a full-fledged branch of economics. Now, in fact, just to talk about the Nobel Prizes in this area, it's so important that thrice Nobel Prizes have been given in and around auction theory. First one, 1996, awarded jointly to Vickery and Merles for their research into the economic theory of incentives under asymmetric information. And auctions are really games where asymmetric information play a major role. Then in 2007, Hurwitz, Maskin, and Meyerson won the Nobel Prize for laying the foundations of mechanism design theory. And auctions are particular kinds of mechanisms, and they also study it. And last October, the 2020 Nobel Prizes in Economics was awarded to Milgrom and Wilson for improvements to auction theory and inventions of new auction format. So you can well guess the importance of this area, and just by the sheer number of Nobel Prizes being awarded in and around this area. Now, all I can say, auction theory has been one of economic success stories. I mean, first of all, lessons and from auction theory have led to important insights elsewhere in economics. On a practical field, spectrum auctions designed by some leading theorists like Milgrom, Wilson, Klemperer, and Binmore were huge successes. In fact, the simultaneous ascending auction was first applied by Milgrom and Wilson in US FCC spectrum auctions, Federal Communication Commission auctions. So such auctions help governments to earn massive revenue and allocate the resources efficiently. So not only it's a very mathematically demanding field, it's a theoretical field, but also it has immense practical applications. Now, what exactly is an auction? Let me come to a main thing. An auction is really a bidding mechanism where things are sold off or bought, described by a set of rules that specify how a winner is to be determined and how much he has to pay. In addition, auction rules may restrict participation and feasible bids. For example, the auctioneer may impose a reserve price. A reserve price means that bids below this reserve price are not acceptable. And it happens all the time. So a typical, very typical auction scenario is as follows. There is a seller who has a single indivisible object. It may be painting house or a tract of land with oil underneath. By the way, auction theory is rich enough to take care of multi-unit auctions also, where more than one units are being sold. For example, spectrum auctions are really multi-unit auctions where spectrums of different wavelengths are being sold. Okay, so that's also possible. The seller does not know how much any buyer would be willing to pay for it. The auction is intended to produce the best sale price in part by identifying the best bid. Now, what's the standard auction? Standard auction is where the object is sold to the highest bidder. So bidders bid for it. Now, who gets the object? The highest bid. Now, this is called a standard auction. In principle, you can think of non-standard auctions also, where you may give it to the second highest bid or the third highest bid. I mean, it's not practiced in real world, but that's why this thing is called a standard auction. The value or reservation price for a bidder is the maximum amount of money he would be willing to pay for the object. Now, a bidder knows his own value but does not know others' value. So in game theory jargon, the value is the type of the bidder. Now, auctions are really modeled as games of incomplete information. And the relevant equilibrium concept that is applied is that. Okay, so in order to do auction theory, you must be familiar with basic game theory, especially analysis of games of incomplete information. Now, let me go to the next slide. Now, what's a procurement auction? Now, procurement auction is one where the auctioneer is the buyer instead of being a seller. The bidders are the sellers. So each bidder possesses one unit of an identical object which is being offered for sale. I mean, it may be several units also. For example, JNU wants to buy computers, 100 computers. It gives some specification that I want this many computers of this specification. And there are companies bidding for it, and the company which bids the lowest gets the object. Here, JNU, the auctioneer, is the buyer, not the seller. Such things are called procurement auctions. The procurement auctions are nothing but standard auctions in reverse. Instead of the highest bidder winning, here the lowest bid wins. And the bidders are really sellers. So it's nothing really changes. It's standard auction in reverse. And in India, public sector enterprises buy a huge set of items using procurement auctions every year, almost every month. Now, all over the world, historically speaking, 4 basic types of auctions are used. So let me talk about that. The first thing is called the first price seal bid auctions. What is this? So there is one indivisible unit up for sale, and there are, suppose, 100 bidders. The bidders simultaneously submit bids. They put bids in sealed envelopes. Now, this means while you are bidding, if you are a bidder, you don't know what others are bidding. The auctioneer collects those envelopes and then opens them. And who wins? The highest bidder wins and pays the price equal to his bid. This is called a first price seal bid auction. Now, first price seal bid auctions are used in auctioning mineral rights in government-owned lands. They're also sometimes used in sales of artwork and real estate. And this method is very frequently used in procurement. Like in India, most public sector organizations, when they go for purchases through procurement auction, they use first price auctions. Okay. See, other examples of this auctions are also seen in markets of refinancing, credit, and in foreign exchange. My point is this auction is used very frequently all over the world. Now, the second type of auction is called the second price seal bid auction. Now, since Vickery was the first person who analyzed it properly, we often call it the Vickery auction. Now, what is the thing out here? There is an auctioneer who has an indivisible item up for sale, and say there are some potential bidders who submits bids in sealed envelope, just like first price auctions. So while you are bidding, you don't know what others are bidding. Now, the highest bidder wins as before. It's a standard auction, but here he pays a price equal to the second highest bid. So suppose the highest bid is 100 and the second highest bid is 90. The person quoting 100 wins, but he actually pays 90. Now, second price auctions are not as prevalent in the real world as first price auctions are. However, they are becoming increasingly more common in today's society due to internet auction website eBay. Now, while eBay does not use sealed bid auction format, since all bid history is available for bidders to see, its method of conducting online auctions is that of a second price sale bid auction. Also, second price sale bid auctions are used in the stamp collecting business in USA. Now, the reason we study second price auction, apart from its empirical significance, is all that it has very nice properties, and Vickery first showed that. We'll come to that later. Now, the third type of auction, which is frequently used in real world, is called English or the ascending auction. As the name suggests, it's originated in England. Now, here, the bids are oral. So the auctioneer starts the bidding process at some price, and then bidders successively make higher bids until there is no bidder willing to bid higher. Okay, so the bidder who submits the final bid wins and pays a price equal to his bid. It's called an ascending auction. So here, if you think of it, the price is continuously rising. So this is an auction you often see in movies. So somebody bids 100 crores, then the other person comes and say, okay, I'll bid 125. Somebody says 150, and it goes on like this till there is a highest bidder at the top and nobody outquotes his bid. Now, English auction is extremely common. I mean, Christie's and Sotheby's, the world's oldest international auction houses, have used English auction format during most of their existence. If you read newspapers, all the great painters' paintings, when they are auctioned off, they it is always auctioned off using English auctions, Dali's, Picasso's, all kinds of things. I mean, Princess Diana's jewelries, everything. Now, the fourth kind of auction is called a Dutch or a descending auction. Here, as the name suggests, it originated in Netherlands. That's why it's called a Dutch auction. The seller starts with a very high price. For example, if I'm the seller, I'll say, okay, this is the price. Is anybody willing to buy it? If nobody is willing to buy it, I lower the price and I continue doing so till such time when one of the buyers put up his hand and says, okay, stop, I'm willing to buy at this price. Okay. So it's called a descending auction because just unlike the English auction, the price continuously comes down. In an English auction, price goes up. Now, Dutch auctions have been used in Netherlands in auctioning of flowers in the wholesale market for many hundreds of years. Now, fish are sold in a similar way in Israel as is timber in Canada. And just to give you another information, when Google, the internet giant we use, went public in 2004, its shares were sold off using a variant of the Dutch auction. Now, there are other kinds of auctions also. One of them is something called an all-pay auction. What's an all-pay auction? Where all bidders pay their bid, regardless of whether he wins or loses. Now, you may ask me, is it really used in real world? Well, not, but this auction format replicates many economic situations like contests, R&D competitions, lobbying, things like that. And such all-pay auctions are used to model these things like contests, lobbying, R&D activity, raising, etc. Okay. Now let me come to the benchmark model of auctions. Any auction theory will start with this. So what's the benchmark model? There is one indivisible item up for sale. There are n bidders and one seller. Now Xi is bidder I's value. That is the maximum price he is willing to pay for it. Now this is private information to player I. What do I mean by private information? This is known only to player I, but not to player J. So other bidders or the sellers do not know bidder I's willingness to pay. Okay. So therein comes the games of incomplete information. So bidder I knows his or her own value, does not know others' value. He only knows that all other values lies in the interval 0 to 1 with distribution function f and density function this. Okay. Now seller only knows that xi lies in the interval 0 to omega with distribution function f and density function small f. Now Vijay Krishna's textbook, which I mentioned here, Krishna 2010, gives a very nice depiction of this benchmark model. You can read that. So there are these bunch of potential bidders. I know my own value. I don't know others. I only know others' values are distributed over this interval with this distribution function. And in the simplest model, we assume that these are independently and identically distributed. Okay, so everybody else's value is distributed over this independently and identically. Okay, that's the idea. Now, I'm coming to that. The benchmark model, like any model in economics, is based on some assumption. Now, what are the assumptions? The first one, it's a case of private values. See, I've talked about value or the maximum willingness to pay, which is private information for a bidder. I know my own value, I don't know yours. Now, this value is a function, when I say it's private value, it's a function of just my own tastes and preferences and nothing else. And this will not change even if I were to know of your tastes and preferences or your values. So that's why it's called a private value. In auction theory, there is something called interdependent values also, where if I come to know of your value, I'll revise my value estimates. Okay. So, but in the simplest benchmark model, we just deal with private values. Now, then we call something called independent types and symmetry. See, here we assume that the valuations are independently and identically distributed. I mentioned this a few minutes back. To any bidder or the seller, the other's valuations are random variable to which he can attribute a joint probability distribution. And each bidder believes that other types are distributed independently of his own type. And lastly, the benchmark model assumes that everybody is risk neutral. Now, auction theory, what it does is it first analyzes the benchmark model and then slowly relaxes the assumptions one by one. What if it's not a case of private values? What if it's not a case of independent types and symmetry? That things are correlated, types are correlated. What if bidders are risk averse? So it's rich enough. And what if more than one item is up for sale? Case of multi-unit auction. It has a rich enough structure to analyze all these things. But today we'll just focus on the benchmark model and some possible extensions with some open research questions on it. I teach auction theory over an entire semester, so I can't cover everything. So I'll just quickly go over to the basics of the benchmark model. So first, let me analyze the second price auction. Now, in a second price auction, the winners pay off his value minus the price he pays. Losers get zero. So who is the winner? The person with the highest bid. What is the price that he pays? The second highest bid. Now let R be the reserve price imposed by the seller. This means that bids below R are not acceptable. So if you want to bid, you have to bid R or more. So the set of actions available for the bidders is this. You can either say no, or if you make a bid, no means I don't want to participate. Participation is voluntary. Or you have to make a bid above R, a price greater than equal to R. A strategy for bidder is a function. In any game of incomplete information, strategies are functions of types. Here the type set is 0 to omega, types are values. So depending on my value, I choose an action. So either I say I don't want to participate, participation is voluntary, or I choose a bid. Now following Vickery, one can show that at a Bayesian-Nash equilibrium, how much will a bidder's bid? The equilibrium bid is given as follows. If your value is more than the reserve price set by the seller, you will bid your value. Otherwise, you will say, no, I don't want to participate in this auction. Now, in fact, Vickery showed that those who bidding your value is a weakly dominant strategy equilibrium in a second price auction. Now, it's a very famous result. I'm sure many of you know this, but I just thought I would re-specify it. So bidding one's own value is a weakly dominant strategy. So in other words, one can say truth-telling is a dominant strategy equilibrium. The person with the highest value will win at a price equal to the value of the second highest bidder. Now let me emphasize the last point, which is here. For private values, the second price auction is equivalent to English auction. What do I mean by that? See, what happens in English auction is that price is continuously rising and bidders are dropping off. Now, so essentially, if you think about the reduced form, you have to think of at what price would you drop off. Now, since it's a case of private values, the information that you have now is you are seeing price, you are now observing the current price, and you also know who are the ones who have dropped off. So when the price reaches your value, you should drop off because your payoff is value minus the price you pay. So in case you win, if the price exceeds your value, you'll get a negative payoff, so you don't want that. So in an English auction with private values, a bidder will drop off when the price reaches its values. So everybody drops off when the price reaches its value. So who remains at the end? The person with the highest value, because others have dropped off. And how much does he pay? He pays the price at which the second highest valued bidder has dropped off. So it's exactly, the final outcome is exactly like the second price auction. That's why we say for private values, the second price auction is equivalent to English auction. But here I have stated it's not so for interdependent values. Why do I say that? See, when you observe other players dropping off, say at some price, you now get to know of their values. Now, if in the case of private values, you won't revise your value, because that's how private values are defined. But in case of interdependent values, now you know that guy has dropped off at a lower price, so I better revise my value. So then English auction will not be equivalent to second price auction. But for the private value model, which is our concern, the benchmark model, the English auction is equivalent to the second price auction. Now, just to digress a bit before coming to first price and Dutch auctions, now let me talk about the first order and second order statistic. See, the values, think of yourself as a seller. You don't know other people's values or willingness to pay. To you, they are all random variables, identically and independently distributed. So they are the random variables x1, x2, x3 up to xn. Now think of a derived random variable, x subscript this within bracket 1. This is the highest among values. Okay. Now this is a derived random variable. So let the distribution function of this be f1v and the density function f1. One can show that the probability that the highest among all values is less than equal to pre-specified value v is f to the power n. The reason is that things are identically and independently distributed. And the density function of this highest order statistic would be small f1v, which is this. Now, what's the second highest order statistics? The second highest among these values. So you have those n identically and independently random variables x1 to xn. Now, if you pick up a sample of size n's, one would be highest, the one would be second highest. But the second highest is itself a random variable, so I call it x2, and in statistical parlance, it's called the second highest order statistic, or second order statistic. And it has its own distribution and density function. I'm not going into the details, but I've specified what it is. Any auction theory textbook or a statistics book will give you the formula. Okay. Also, there is another derived variable which is used in auction theory, which is this. Imagine you are bidder 1. You know your own value x1. You don't know others' values, which is x2 to xn. But you may be interested, what is the maximum of the others' values, others' willingness to pay? So y depicts this thing. You may be bidder 1 or 2, it doesn't matter, because since everything is identically and independently distributed, we are in a symmetric model. So y, this random variable, is really the maximum of others' values. And capital G is the distribution function of y, and small g is the density function of y. Okay, now let me go over to this. Now, why did I mention this? Suppose you are a seller and you have organized a second price auction. Now, what is the expected price that you can get? Now, just to give you an example, suppose the distribution of values is uniform over 0 to 1. And let's, for simplicity, assume reserve price is 0. Now, in a second price auction, all bidders bid their value. Who wins? The person with the highest value. How much does he pay? The price equal to the second highest value. So the expected revenue or price. Revenue and price here are the same because only one unit is being sold. To the seller is the expected value of the second highest value, and that is given by this. And in this case, where F is uniform over 0, 1, this is just an illustrative example with n bidders. The expected price that a seller will get in the second price auction will be n minus 1 by n plus 1. Now let us all think of a first price auction. Now, in a first price auction, the winner's payoff is value minus the price he pays. The loser gets 0. Because in a first price auction, the highest bidder wins and pays his bid. Since the winner pays the amount he has quoted, it is never optimal to bid one's value. So you can intuitively figure out that I must bid something lower than my value, but there is a catch. The lower you bid, the lower is your probability of winning. However, it's also true that lower you bid, higher will be your payoff conditional on winning the thing. So in equilibrium, intuitively you can figure out these two effects must balance each other out, and one can show that in equilibrium in a first price auction, this is going to be the Bayesian bidding strategy. First, that if your value is less than the reserve price, you will drop out. You say, no, I don't want to participate. But if your bid is above the reserve price, value is above the reserve price, you will make a bid equal to this amount. Now, there is a bit of a complicated calculation at its back, but one can show that this is everybody adopting this strategy is a symmetric Bayesian Nash equilibrium. And here one can show that bids are strictly increasing values. In fact, couple of other points. Suppose R is 0, reserve price is 0. Then you can show that a bidder's equilibrium bid is equal to the expected value of the maximum of his competitor's value, conditional on that value being less than his own. So in equilibrium, my bid will equal to the expectation of the maximum of my rival's values, given that value being lower than mine, which is this thing. It's a very interesting conclusion. And of course, all bids are less than values, and as n goes up, bids go up, and the limit reaches your value. More competition induces bidders to bid higher. That's the idea. Now, what about the first price versus Dutch auction? Now, since I have limited time, I can tell you that a Dutch auction is strategically equivalent to the first price auction. Just think of it, what's happening in a Dutch auction? Price is coming down and you have to say, put up your hand and say, okay, I'm willing to buy at this price. Now, once a bidder says so, the game stops. So you really cannot observe anybody else doing anything else, because once the bidder says, yes, I'm willing to buy, the game ends. So strategically, the situation is exactly same as a first price auction. So you have to think of at what price should I say yes, which means how much should be my bid amount. And it essentially means the Dutch auction is same as first price auction. Okay. Now, what is the expected revenue in a first price auction? Suppose reserve price is 0 and F is uniform over 0, 1, the same example we did for second price auction. Then in equilibrium, you can show that bids would be this. B would be n minus 1 by n, V less than V. In a second price auction, bids would be equal to V. And the expected revenue to the seller in this auction would be how much will the winner pay? Winner will pay his bid. Who is the winner? The person with the highest value. So person with the highest value is this. That's a random variable. How much does he bid? B of this. And so it's the expected value of this. It so turns out it's same as the expected revenue in a second price auction. Okay. Now, let me go to something quickly called the all-pay auction. And the all-pay auction, every bidder pays his bid. This auction is often used to analyze lobbying, context, R&D competition, etc. I told you before. And the Bayesian-Nash equilibrium in an all-pay auction would be this. So you say no if your value is below some cutoff X star. Now, what is the X star? It depends on reserve price R. So X star is such that this equation is satisfied. Okay. Now, what's an expected revenue in an all-pay auction? Suppose we consider the same example. F is uniform over 0, 1 with no reserve price. This would imply X star is also 0. Then in equilibrium, you can show that each bidder in an all-pay auction will bid this amount, which would be the less than what you would bid in a first price auction. Okay. Now, the expected revenue to the seller, here all bidders pay. So it would be n times expected bid amount from everybody, and one can show it's again going to be n minus 1 by n plus 1. So which is same as the expected revenue in a second price auction or in a first price auction. Now, is this a coincidence? The answer is no. This is nothing but the very famous revenue equivalence theorem, which is one of the fundamental theorems of auction theory. So we have the revenue equivalence theorem, and Riley and Samuelson has a very nice paper on this. So in the SIPV class of auction, what do I mean by an SIPV class of auction? The symmetric independent private value class of auction. The benchmark model, where those 4 or 5 assumptions are satisfied. That is private value, identically and independently distributed thing, and risk neutral bidders. The expected revenue to the seller across almost all auctions would be this. So it just depends on the distribution function and this X star. Now, what is X star? X star is the value below which it is unprofitable to submit a bid. So bidders below X star do not produce a bid. Now, how is this X star determined? X star is determined by reserve prices and or entry fee. So any 2 auctions where the X star is the same will give you the same expected revenue. And we saw an illustration of that in our example. So it's a very general theorem. It's called the revenue equivalence theorem. Now, Meyerson is in his remarkable 1981 paper as the most general version of this result. And it says that assume each of a given number of risk-neutral potential buyers of an object has a privately known signal independently drawn from a common, strictly increasing atomless distribution. Then any auction mechanism in which the object always goes to the buyer with the highest signal, and any bidder with the lowest feasible signal expects 0 surplus, gives the same expected revenue. Now, this is a remarkable result and one of the fundamental things in auction theory. Now, the revenue equivalence is so fundamental that much of auction theory can be understood in terms of it. Now, Meyerson's remarkable paper also shows how to derive optimal auction. Now, actually, he couched it in the term of mechanism design. So suppose you have something up for sale. What is the optimal way of selling this? The Meyerson's 1981 remarkable seminal paper solves this problem. Okay, now let me quickly go. Although this work was a remarkable achievement, there seemed to be little relationship with traditional price theory. Now, this gap was filled up by Bulow and Roberts in their JP 1989 paper, and where they showed that the optimal auction problem can therefore be understood by applying the usual logic of marginal revenue versus marginal cost in the context of a standard third-degree monopoly price discrimination. Now, Just to give you, before coming to the extension and research questions, a simple illustration of the symmetric model. Suppose xx is the seller's value for the object. A seller's value is the minimum price at which he is willing to sell. A buyer's value is the maximum price at which he is willing to buy. One can show that the total expected gain to the seller is this. I have taken it from Riley and Samuelson's paper, and any X star can be induced by appropriate choice of reserve price and entry fees. So therefore, since this is the total expected gain to the seller, now the problem is what X star should be induced so as to maximize this gain. And X star can be induced through choice of reserve prices, right? And the answer is the X star, which does so satisfies the following equations. We just now provide an example. Suppose there are two bidders and F is uniform over 0, 1. And let's, for simplicity, suppose XX, the seller's value is 0. Then one can show the optimal X star is half. Just in terms of first price and second price auctions, in a first price or a second price auction, X star is equal to reserve price that we show. Now, if you set the reserve price to be 0, then seller's expected revenue in a two-bidder case where F is uniform over 0, 1 will be shown to be 1/3. But by choosing X star optimally, which is half, and X star is equal to R, the expected revenue can be jacked up to 5/12. Now, what about in an all-pay auction? Now, in an all-pay auction, X star will be not equal to R, but root over R in this specific two-bidder auction with uniform distribution. Since optimal X star is half, the optimal reserve price in an all-pay auction would be 1/4. But that would give rise to the same expected revenue 5/12. Okay. So as just notice that this X star is important. Now, given an auction, R can induce different X stars in different auctions. But as long as the X star is the same, the expected revenue, which is this part, is the same across auctions. That's the fundamental result. And now we just talked about what X star should be induced so as to maximize my gain. Now, see, as I mentioned before, auction theory is rich enough to relax all the assumptions of the benchmark model, and it has done so. For example, asymmetry, the distributions are no longer the same. Bidders or sellers are risk averse. Types are correlated. Valuations are interdependent. That is, in a private value case, even if I come to know of your value, I will not change mine. But here it's the opposite. I'll change mine if I know your value. And this stands in contrast to private value. For example, your value for a painting may depend mostly on your private information, how much you like it, but also somewhat on others' private information, how much they like it, because this affects the resale value and the prestige of owning it. Now, multi-unit auctions have also been analyzed, and these are relaxations of the assumption. However, now I will talk about the possible research problems within the canonical model. And I have personally done some work on it, and I'll suggest some open research questions. So the next half of the lecture will be devoted to that. So let me talk about moving away from the canonical model. Now, the canonical model or the benchmark model, which I specified, is based on quasi-linear utility functions with high enough incomes. This private value thing, where in such a case, the demand for the indivisible good and consequently its valuation is independent of income. See, we said somebody's value is xi. But there is no income component in it. This means the value is independent of income. Now, this is only possible if you assume at the back of your mind a quasi-linear utility function with high enough incomes. Go back to your micro days and you will remember. Now, as a result, private information of values tantamounts to private information about utility functions. So it may be noted that the quasi-linear utility function where depends only on price and not on income, at least for large enough levels of income, is more appropriate for modeling a situation where the demand for a good isn't very sensitive to income. For example, demand for papers or pencils or salt is not likely to change with changes in income. Right? So if your income increases, you are not likely to consume more salt. Most likely, any increase in income would go into consumption of other goods. On the other hand, demand for a piece of painting or demand for a house is very likely to be sensitive to income. That's very realistic, isn't it? So consequently, an utility function which allows for income effects, and I underline this is very important, is possibly more appropriate when one analyzes auctions for indivisible goods like paintings or houses. So we are now going to deal with such cases which utility functions which allow for income effects, because the canonical model is based on quasi-linear utility function with high enough income, so income effects are ruled out. So what do you propose? So now we'll deal with a more general class of utility functions. Okay, to make matters just a minute. To make our life simple, we'll consider a two-good world, where good X is a perfectly divisible object and good Y is an indivisible object. Think of good X as being food and good Y as some painting or a house. Okay. Now, individual's income, MI, may be thought as the total amount of resources that's available to him. So that's all I have. Now, what I'll do, I'll use just standard microtheoretic techniques and standard assumption to derive the valuation VI for good Y as a function of his income. So this will link budget constraint to valuation. My primary objective is this linking the canonical model to the demand theory and see what happens when utility functions are such that demand for the indivisible object is sensitive to income. Then does revenue equivalence hold, and if it holds, in what ways? And then what are the other research questions that can be explored here? So what's our model? So this I'll just slowly, we consider a two-good world where an individual I has utility function uxy, where x is the divisible good, so you can consume any non-negative amount of x, and y is the indivisible item. So either you don't consume y, which is 0, or 1. So y is a 0-1 thing. Either you buy a house or you don't buy a house, something like that. It's an indivisible. So this means that any non-negative amount of good x can be consumed, but in case of good y, there are only two choices. Either it can be consumed or not. Now, individual's income is MI. So it's extremely simple. So we make some assumptions on that. So what's the first assumption? U00 is 0. Very simple. And for all y in 0, 1, uxy is continuous in x for all x, and partially differentiable with respect to x. So del u del x is well defined. And the second assumption is uxy is strictly increasing in both x and y. This is very standard. So ux1 would be strictly greater than ux0 for all x. And for all y in 0, 1, if x1 is more than x2, ux1y would be strictly greater than ux2. Okay. And the other assumption is that, see, what is U01? It's the utility that you will get when you consume 0 unit of x, but 1 unit of the indivisible item. Ux0 for x high enough would be strictly greater than U01. So limit as x approaches infinity, I mean, this is very reasonable also, right? If you consume more and more of X, your utility will increase, and at some point it will cross this. That's the idea. So with these three very standard assumptions, I will now try to figure out the value for Y. That is, how much is the person, what is the maximum price the person is willing to pay for Y. This will come out of his utility maximization exercise subject to budget constraint. So before that, some other analysis. Note that A1 to A3 imply this U00 is 0 less than UMI0. So the sign of this is not known. Now, since Uxi is continuous and strictly increasing in X, see, when M is 0, this thing is strictly less than U01. Now you continuously increase this. And assumption 3 says for high enough X, this will cross U01. Hence, there exists a unique Y such that unique K such that UK0 is equal to U01. K is a cutoff level of income. And so UMI0 is less than equal to U01 if and only if MI is less than equal to K. Okay, it's very simple. So let price of X food item, let's say, be 1. So it's the numerator, and price of Y be P. Okay, so what's the individual's problem? So you maximize UXY subject to X plus PY is less than equal to M. There's a budget constraint, very standard micro-theoretic thing, maximizing utility subject to a budget constraint. Now, there are two possible cases. Your income is less than K or it is more than K. And what is K? K is the cutoff level. It's a unique thing which solves this. UK0 is equal to U01, and K is such that for all Mi less than equal to K, this will be true, and for all Mi greater than equal to K, UMI0 will be strictly greater than U01. Okay. Now, how do I derive it? Let me quickly go through it. Case 1, when income is lower than K. And in that case, this is true. It may be noted that if price is less than MI and the individual purchases Y, this is P is price of Y. Price of good X is given to be 1. So I'm trying to derive the demand for Y. Y is the indivisible commodity, say house or a painting. So he can spend MIP on X and get this utility. But if he does not purchase Y and spends his entire income on X, he will get this much of utility. Now, this inequality easily follows, right? I'm not going into the details, just a look at this will show you why this is true. It follows from the assumption. Therefore, the individual will buy good at price P if and only buying good Y means choosing Y equal to 1. Because there are only two choices. You either choose Y equal to 0 or Y equal to 1. If and only if this is greater than equal to 0, or if and only P is less than equal to MI. So therefore, in this case, the maximum price he is willing to pay for good Y is equal to his income. So valuation would be equal to income. So when income is less than equal to K, the maximum price that the individual would be willing to pay for the indivisible object is equal to his income. That's what I have figured out logically from here. Now, what about when income is more than K? And in that case, we know from before this inequality holds true. Now, from our assumption, it follows there is always a number C such that UC1 would be equal to UM0. See, U01 is less than UM0. Now, increase this 0 part, put some X, and because at some point this will be equal to UM0, call that point C. Clearly, C is strictly increasing in MI. Now, as before, if price of Y is less than equal to MI, see, price of Y is more than MI, the person will not buy because he's not able to buy. And the individual purchases Y, he can spend this much on X and get this. And if he does not purchase Y and spends his entire income on X, like before, he gets this much. So utility, from the utility functions, we get this inequality. And one can show that utility of mi minus p1 is greater than equal to utility of uc1 if and only if mi minus p is greater than equal to c. That's clear from here. Now, hence, the individual will buy good at price P, that is, buy 1 unit of the indivisible object Y if and only if the price of Y is less than or equal to Mi by C. Essentially, it means that the maximum price I'm willing to pay for the object is this. So that's how we have come to this valuation function. Valuation is nothing but the maximum willingness to pay for it. When your income is less than K, your maximum willingness to pay for it is equal to Mi. When your income is more than K, your maximum willingness to pay for it is Mi minus C, where what is C? Where UC0 is equal to UMI0. See, from standard utility maximization exercise demand theory, we have derived the valuation for good Y, the maximum price that he is willing to pay. Now, note that when Mi is between 0 to K, when income is low enough, valuations are strictly increasing in income because it is equal to Mi. And when Mi is more than K, income is high enough, the valuation may be increasing constant or even decreasing in income. We will illustrate this with some examples. That is interesting because I just want to illustrate that. So first, take the standard case. Suppose utility is quasi-linear in X. That is, uxy is X plus u hat y, where u hat 1 is greater than u hat 0 equal to 0. Hence, u01 is u hat 1 and umi0 is mi. Note that here the k, the cutoff point would be, cutoff level of income is u hat 1, and the valuation function would be this for this specific utility function. See, I just want to dwell on this. I started by saying that the canonical model is based on quasi-linear utility with high enough incomes. So look at this case, when incomes are high enough, when Mi is greater than K. What is valuation? U hat 1. Now, in the canonical model, we assume I know my valuation, I don't know yours. So I know my U hat 1, I don't know yours U hat 1. That's exactly being used in the canonical model, although they don't specify it this way. But what I have been able to do is, through a proper utility maximizing exercise, I have been able to come to this. But what do I do with it? Now, let me go over to some other points. In our model, the value of the object is the maximum price that an agent is willing to pay and able to pay for it, because we are maximizing utility subject to budget constraints. Now, it may be noted this is different from one particular strand in the literature. Now, we draw attention to a very interesting paper by Che Gale, RES 98, where preferences are quasi-linear and valuation, which is independent of income, is the maximum price that an agent is willing to pay but not necessarily able to pay. In short, the definition of value used in our paper is different from the one used in Che and Gale. Now, Che and Gale's model, to my mind, is applicable in the corporate world, where a company values some asset as something. It doesn't have the money to pay for it, but it can borrow funds to pay for it. But for individuals, people, ordinary individuals, when they go for bidding, I think valuation should be defined as the maximum price I'm willing to pay and able to pay. I mean, that's why I'm saying the definition of the value used in our paper is different from the one used in Che and Gale. Che and Gale, there is a strand of literature there. It's an influential paper. So as in this model, quasi-linear model, suppose if when all incomes are more than k, we are back to this canonical thing. So in the standard textbook auction, each bidder knows his VI equal to U hat I, but does not know other bidders VJ. Now let's take some other examples. Suppose UXY takes this form, and now even for high enough incomes, the value is not independent of income, but it depends on income. Clearly, VI here is strictly increasing in MI for all MI. That's what you expect. But in fact, I'm now going to show you an example where VI is even decreasing in MI, and that is given by this. Okay. Now, be that as it may, let me go to our story and what are the research problems. So we have sort of set up the stage. So we are going to deal with a more general utility function that there are two goods, good X and good Y. Good X is the food, and suppose good X is available at a store at price 1. One good of Y can be obtained in an auction. So good Y is not available in a store at a fixed price, but it has to be obtained in an auction. So you have to participate in that. And price of good Y will be determined in the Bayesian-Nash equilibrium of the auction. So therefore, consumer is no longer a price taker as far as good Y is concerned. His bid affects the equilibrium price of Y. So we assume that under no circumstances can a bidder with income MI pay more than MI for any good. And then we assume that if a bidder I were to bid more than MI in the auction for good wine and default, then a penalty would be imposed. Okay, so this ensures that you always remain within your means. So individualized problem is to choose a bid to maximize expected utility. Now, in this context, we analyze and consider three types of auction: first price, second price, and all pay. Okay. Now, however, we would like to be as close as possible to the canonical model, which is really based on quasi-linear utility with risk-neutral bidders, right? We will move away from quasi-linearity, but keep risk neutrality. So how do you do that? So first of all, we take K as a critical benchmark of the level of income. So if all incomes are below K, then we say incomes are low enough. If all incomes are above K, we say incomes are high enough. Okay. Now what do? We consider the following class of utility function where the individual is risk neutral, because we want to stay as close as possible to the original canonical model. Now, note that in our framework, an individual would be risk neutral if and only if this holds. Now, why is this so? Just see Krebs's book, Macroeconomics book, chapter 6. Okay, that would give you, because you look at the indirect utility function, and if the second derivative of the indirect utility with respect to money is equal to 0, we say individuals are risk neutral. That's what I have used here. Now, it is clear that to be consistent with the assumption of risk neutrality, the only possible, and I stress only possible, utility function which displays risk neutrality is this. So what is this? So we are going to operate with this u of xi is wx when you don't consume y, and uxy is qx plus s when you consume y. So therefore, u01 would be just s. So this is what you would get by consuming only y and no x. Now, where q is greater than equal to w, strictly greater than 0, and s is strictly greater than 0. Okay. Now, this utility function will display risk neutrality, and we need, now look at this q. Q is the marginal utility of x when you consume y, and w is the marginal utility of x when you don't consume y. Now, since Q is greater than equal to W, so marginal utility of this X is higher or greater than equal to when you consume Y than in the case when you don't consume Y. So please keep that in mind. Now here I have explained why I need Q greater than equal to W, which is strictly greater than 0, and S greater than 0, because if you don't assume that, you will be contradicting the first three assumptions. So in order to be consistent with our assumptions, we need Q greater than equal to W greater than 0 and S greater than 0. Okay, and quickly, don't have much. For this utility function, we get K, that critical point, to be S by W, and the valuation function to be this. When M is less than K, which is equal to S by W, values are equal to income. When M is more than K, values are equal to this. Okay. Now, just to compare this case with the canonical model, note that if Q equal to W, we are back to the canonical model. Now, if Q equal to W, what is valuation? It's just S by Q. And so each player's S by W's or S by Q, whatever you call it, when Q is equal to W, is private information. And we are back to the canonical model. But since we want to move away from the canonical model, we'll assume Q greater than W, right? So since we want to focus on non-quasi-linearity, where bidders are risk neutral with high enough incomes, we'll assume Q greater than W and MI greater than S by W for all. Now note this. Now what should be private information? Unlike the canonical model where Q equal to W and S by Q or S by W is the private information, now we have a lot of choices. M can be private information, S can be private information, W can be private information, Q or all of them. Now, what I have done in one of my previous papers, I have analyzed the case, what happens when incomes are private information. And then for this conference presentation, I also did what happens when Q, W, or S are private information. And I have come up with some interesting facts. And then I'll quickly go through them, and then I'll talk about the possible research problems. So private information in this context, any one or more of the four things can be private information, that is types. Now dealing with multidimensional types, say both Q and W are private information, is technically difficult and often intractable. So in this lecture, at least, we deal with each case separately. In one case, Q will be private information, others are common knowledge. In the other case, W will be private information, others are common knowledge, and so on. And then what we do, we compare the expected revenues for the cases. So let me skip this. This slide is not important. I've still some. What happens when income is private information? Now, in one of my previous papers, I have analyzed this scenario. Now, if incomes are private information, I assume that W, S, and Q are same for everybody and common knowledge. Now, this means all individuals have same utility functions but different incomes. Now, an example of this would be a specific sociocultural milieu where people tend to have similar tastes but differ in their income. They have the same cultural, social, and historical background, so their tastes and values are sufficiently close to justify the assumption of identical preferences. On the other hand, they have different skills and productivities, and this is reflected in the difference in their incomes. So here each bidder knows its MI but does not know others' MJs, so it believes that others' MJs are distributed over this range with distribution function f, and it is assumed that it's distributed identically and independently. So W, S, and Q are same for everybody, and common knowledge. Now we assume all agents have high enough income. For that, we need M lower bar. The lowest income is also greater than K, and Q strictly greater than W, non-quasi-linearity. Now, one of the main results that I have been able to derive here is there is partial revenue equivalence. That is, first price auction revenue is R1. This is second price auctions revenue. This is all pay auctions revenue. There is revenue equivalence between first price and second price auction, but all pay auctions expected gives you an expected revenue which is strictly higher than what you would get in first price and second price auction. This is clearly different from the benchmark model, where all auctions give you the same expected revenue, where the revenue equivalence holds. But here it's only holds partially, where I have taken M to be, the incomes to be private information. What if, suppose S is private information, what happens? That is, each bidder knows its own SI but does not know other SG. Okay, it only believes everybody else's is distributed over this distribution with a distribution function F and density function small f. And W, M, and Q are same for everybody and common knowledge. Now this means the individuals have different utility functions but same incomes. Okay, because I'm assuming every W, M, and Q are same, but S is different. Whenever S, W, or Q are different, utility would be different. Say, different. All bidders have different utility functions. And the private information is over S component, right? Now here I have computed before this talk, and I have assumed that all incomes are over K, so S by W, and Q strictly greater than W to make it as close as possible to our original model. Here I get the same result. There is partial revenue equivalent. First price and second price gives you the same expected revenue, but all pay auctions give you a strictly higher revenue. So what one can say is that whether income is private information or S, that part is private information, it doesn't matter. First price and second price auction gives you same utility, but all pay auction gives you a strictly higher utility. Okay, so if S, this part, U01, see U01 is equal to S. If this thing is private information, then the results are similar to the case where income is private information. Now, what about when W or Q is private information? Now, look, W is the marginal utility of X when you don't consume Y. Q is the marginal utility of X when you consume Y. All we know is that Q is strictly greater than W when things are non-quasi-linear. Now, before this talk, I had sort of computed that too, and that is as follows. Let me come to that. So S is done. So suppose Q is private information. That is, each bidder knows its QI but does not know others' QJ. And they believe, I believe your Q is distributed over this interval with some known distribution function. W, M, and S are same for everybody and common knowledge. This means, again, the individuals have same different utility functions but same incomes. Now, we need this for non-quasi-linearity and this for high enough income. What about the result? Result is again partial revenue equivalence in the sense first price and second price auction gives you the same revenue. However, we can show that all pay auctions revenue, expected revenue is different from R1 and R2, but you cannot say whether it is greater than or less than. At least I have not been able to theoretically compare this. Okay. Now, so this is different from the effect when, say, M or S is private information. See, when S is private information, this holds true, but RAP is strictly higher than R1 and R2. Here we know RAP is not equal to R1 or R2, but we cannot say whether it's greater or less. So when Q is private information, we get this. What happens when W is private information? Well, the answer is it's exactly the same as the case when Q is private information. Recall that W is the marginal utility of X when you don't consume Y, and Q is the marginal utility of X when you consume Y. If either of them are by private information, the results are exactly the same. You have partial revenue equivalence R1 and R2 same, but you know that all pig auction gives you different revenue, but you don't know whether it's higher or lower. At least theoretically, I cannot arrive at a general result. Okay. Unlike the case where S or M are private information. So what's the upshot? With risk neutrality, high enough incomes and non-quasi-linear preferences, which is Q strictly greater than W, we always have partial revenue equivalence. Now RAP, the expected revenue with all pay auction, is higher in the first two cases when S or M is private information, but we still cannot anything in the last two cases. So we only know RAP would be not be equal to R1 and R2 in the last two cases, like Q or W are private information. Now, what are the research problems that you can think of? Think of this. In our model, first price and second price auctions yield the same revenue. Does it mean in general, with non-quasi-linearity, revenue equivalence hold between auctions in which only the winner pays, and such equivalence fails when there are multiple payments? For example, in all pay auctions, all bidders pay, right? So therefore, the research question is, with an non-quasi-linear utility function in a two-good world, is it the case that there is partial revenue equivalence, first price and between first price and second price auction, only where in auctions where only the winner pays? I mean, a definitive answer would clearly require more research, and I think it's an interesting research question. Now, this one is a hard research question. What happens when types are multidimensional? So see, we have how many parameters? M, income; W, marginal utility of X when you don't consume Y; Q, marginal utility of X when you consume Y; and S, which is equal to U01. We took each one of them one by one. So what happens when S is private information? What happens when M is private information? And things like that. Now, what if more than one is private information, so that the types are multidimensional? I have not done it. There are 4 things. You can start with a couple of them. What happens when S and Q are private information? Now, just to warn you, a caveat, it's quite intractable, but you can start doing with a 2-bidder case, and maybe start doing with the specific distribution function. Okay, that will give you an inkling, and then see what happens. But this may be hard, but this may be a very good research problem for PhDs. Okay, now it would be interesting to compute the expected revenue maximizing optimal mechanism. This may be a very hard problem. I mean, we can follow Meyerson's thing, but Meyerson did it in a quasi-linear model with risk neutrality. Ours is risk neutral, but not quasi-linear. So just a couple of papers, I've mentioned few papers here. They have analyzed optimal mechanisms with budget constrained bidders. And in these papers, the valuation, which is independent of income, is the maximum price that an agent is willing to pay but not necessarily able to pay. On the other hand, in our model, valuation is not independent of income. It's dependent on income, is the maximum price that an agent is willing to pay and able to pay. Consequently, the suggested course of future research optimal mechanism within our model will be a complement to the approach taken in these papers. So if you try this, it may be a hard problem, but I think it's worth trying. Now, before ending, just let me give you something. What happens when all incomes are low enough? That is, all incomes are below K. Okay. And here, what happens is VI, we have seen, is equal to MI. Now, so you are willing to devote your entire income, the maximum price you are willing to pay for the indivisible object is your income. This will possibly be true in certain poor socioeconomic categories, especially in emerging economies like India. For example, think of gold. Anecdotal evidence suggests that due to some cultural reasons, people from such communities often crave for certain items like gold or precious stones, and they are willing to pay large sums to acquire such goods. This implies for such a class of relatively poor people who belong to this socio-cultural milieu, the utility of acquiring only the indivisible item, say a gold ornament, is much higher than the utility of consuming only the divisible good, say food, by devoting his entire income to the purchase of this good. For example, the demand for gold in India has been very resilient even in the most trying circumstances. The World Gold Council notes that Indian consumers have been steadfast in their desire for gold, even in the face of very challenging circumstances, most notably extreme adverse squeeze on rural income. So what happens when all incomes are low enough? So VI is equal to MI. So in one of my previous papers, I have considered this case also. So we take incomes to be private information and all incomes are low enough. And we analyze first price, second price, and all pay auction. And the surprising result is that bidding one's own value, that is bid equal to value equal to income, is an equilibrium not only in second price auction, but also in first price and all pay auctions. The fact that bidding one's value can be equilibrium even in all pay auctions is surprising and counterintuitive. This has not been worked out in the literature before, and we can show that revenue equivalence, of course, fails. The second price auction gives you the lowest possible revenue. So it's strictly less than the revenue in the first price auction, which is strictly less than the expected revenue in the all pay auction. So this happens when all incomes are low enough. Now that comes to again, another research problem. We have assumed that either all incomes are high enough or all incomes are low enough. Okay. We have not analyzed the case when some incomes are high and some incomes are low. Now, I tried doing it. It's very complex, but maybe it's worth trying it. So you can think of two bidders. See, one of them, the income is below S by W. S by W is the K, is equal to K. Remember that cutoff. And the other's income is above K. And now think of, you can make income to be private information or some other parameter, and then try to derive equilibrium, at least in first price, second price, and all pay auctions. Okay. And revenue implications. And that should be an interesting and, of course, challenging future course of research. I think this may be a very interesting thing, where some incomes are low enough and some incomes are high enough. So you can start with two, as I said, two bidders. Now, let me say in my book in 2017, I wrote a book. I list some more open research problems on auctions and oligopoly. You can look at that. Now, one of them is on scoring auctions. If you look at chapter 4 of my book, and I list some open research problems. Okay, I don't have the time to discuss that, but you can please have a look if you have the time. And there is also a small but growing literature on auctions and oligopoly together. See, in many markets, say, for example, a firm first bid for a license in an auction, license to produce something. And then after they have obtained the license, they go to a market and compete as an oligopoly. So you need both oligopoly models and auction models and their interactions to analyze, say, final equilibrium outcomes. These are a bit complicated, but that one can do it. And in chapter 2 of my book, I've done one such exercise and also suggest some research problems there. If you are interested, please have a look at this. And then towards the end, I've listed the references. So if you are interested, please do look at it. I will end here. I thank all of you and I thank the organizers for providing me with this wonderful opportunity. And I look forward to interactions with you. I'll send the slides to Dev Datta, who can share the slides with you. And I look forward to interactions with one of all of you someday in the later half of February when the conference begins. Okay. Thank you, and I will call it a day now.